Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. In today's special episode, we sat down with Laura Harth, campaign director with Safeguard Defenders, and Cleo Paskal, associate fellow at Chatham House. They touch on the human rights suppression and censorship not just in China but around the world, how it's ramped up amid the Winter Olympics, and what can be done going forward. Let's dive in. Thank you so much for joining us today. Great to have you on the show.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure. I've learned a lot from your show, and it's a delight and a privilege to be on.
Thank you, Tiffany. Great to be with you.
So it seems the Beijing Winter Olympics are starting amid a lot of controversy. There is the political boycott happening where politicians, a lot of diplomats aren't going, but athletes are still going. And so for these athletes who are going to China, there seems to be some concern that if they speak out about, say, human rights or stuff, they could be punished. So how much danger are they in?
Well, I think we got a taste of what might happen just 2 weeks ago when obviously a representative of China's National Olympic Committee spoke during a press conference online at the Washington embassy saying that, they will be liable criminally before the law if they do speak up. Now, what does that mean? It might not mean anything. I think a lot of governments will have recommended their athletes to keep quiet, behave, to avoid any controversy. I think one of the things we activists fear is that a lot of governments might feel fearful in the next weeks as the Olympics go on, as they have athletes within mainland China, in Beijing, to speak up, maybe to act out against those egregious human rights violations. Obviously, there's been a lot of experience with hostage diplomacy. They know that people get detained over the smallest things, as happens to, a lot of people, Chinese people within mainland China. So I feel very wary for them. I think there was some appeals also by athletes, by the European Athletes Association, for example, last summer, asking the national committees, asking their governments, asking the IOC, how are you going to protect us? But not only how are you going to protect us physically, but how are you going to protect our fundamental rights? We have freedom of expression, we have freedom of opinion. We know that the IOC updated their guidelines, their famous Article 50 prior to the Tokyo Games, allowing, some kind of political messaging to be displayed. How is that going to translate in Beijing? Well, I think we're now at the start of the Olympics and they're still waiting for a response. So it's just, I feel for them because they're basically being asked to, follow the CCP's rule. And I think it just goes to show where we are in the world today and how brazen this regime has been allowed to become.
So I think the world's athletes are essentially becoming Chinese for the extent of the time that they're in the country. So they're going to experience all of the repression and the surveillance and the lack of individual rights that the average Chinese person experiences on a daily basis. And the invasiveness is quite shocking. They're being forced to download an app, the My 2022 app, which, as you would expect, is a surveillance app. So they have to use it for all of their travel data and all of their health data, but also analytics have found that the audio can't be turned off. So it can pick up audio, which is then analyzed and stored on Chinese servers. So even down to that level of detail, they're being asked to use the digital yuan if they can. So there are only three currencies that are accepted in the village. There's cash, there's Visa, and there's the digital yuan, which again is a method of surveillance, which the Chinese government is trying to roll out across China. The COVID testing regime is completely opaque. So yes, they are being tested, but I don't know whether there's verification over whether those positive tests are actually positive tests or are being used to manipulate who can compete and who can continue their training regimes. So in many different ways, the athletes are going to, while in China, experience the same sort of control and repression that the Chinese people do, and it will follow them once they leave as well. As the tracking continues, the Chinese government will have their biodata, all that sort of stuff. So it's quite disturbing that the International Olympic Committee has put people in harm's way to this degree.
And so it seems like, say, in China right now, Beijing is trying to use the games as a not political means. They don't want any athletes speaking out on political grounds, right? But it seems like part of that, there's a lot of issues, right? So one part, there are no spectators that China hasn't handpicked. There's no general public that's allowed in. And then all the athletes are in a bubble. They're separated from anyone. But despite all of those precautions, there has been like ramp up in, say, detaining human rights lawyers, even just people of faith. So how do you see all of that playing out as the Olympics progress?
So it depends on how effective the psychological and media warfare component of their three warfares has been, and it seems to have been in terms of the mainstream media. And this is again something that we're seeing kind of internationally, that this kind of the battlefield is shifting away from mainstream media control to online media control. So we saw it around, for example, the Canadian trucker story. What's happening with the Canadian trucker story? It wasn't really touched in a lot of mainstream media, but because several very important online outlets took it on as a story, it gained traction. The same thing is happening with the Olympics. So if what you're watching is the mainstream media, if you're watching NBC or whatever, you're getting one set of impressions from it. But if you're looking online in the Twitterverse or whatever, you have a very different sense of what's going on. So it's a byproduct of, again, this control over these global systems and how effective they will be. And China knows that very well, which is why they have several 100,000 people trying to influence social media environment as well. But fundamentally, you have to believe, and I do, that the truth resonates. It takes a lot of effort to sell lies over and over and over again, and in some ways it takes so much less effort when you've got the truth on your side, and it starts to make things more real for you and more calm for you when you say, right, okay, this is a terrible thing to be happening for the people of China, but also for our competitors, for our citizens. And that message, it lets you put all of those little dots that you've had separated together into a way of looking at the world that is real. And it's almost a relief. And so I think that it's this battle for the mind space, because this is essentially what it is not over. I think that there are a lot of good people, yourself included, who have been trying to get information, and people can identify when that information makes sense. So I'm definitely not giving up, obviously. But this fight isn't, we're talking, yes, it is in the international community and it's in these global things, but fundamentally it's in the minds of each individual, which is what is trying to be controlled. And I don't think that it will be effective universally to such a degree going forward.
Well, what we've seen over the past years in general, since Xi Jinping came to power, there's really been a ramping up of obviously the number of trials, the number of people in detention in the official judicial system, which has just been deteriorating at the speed of light. But there's been a ramping up also of everything that we call the UN experts, those that China does not like to mention, of enforced disappearances. So they've just been installing more and more methods of forcefully disappearing people, keeping them in incommunicado detention, torturing them, bringing them to forced confessions, and obviously instilling fear in the wider community, because this is not something that just touches upon the person that is detained, that is disappeared. It obviously instills fears in the wider community, in their family, other human rights offenders, but also maybe, ordinary people that have had their property seized unlawfully and would, like to counter that, but feel fear of actually standing up to this regime. And so obviously this has been going on for years. We're talking tens of thousands of people every single year, most of them human rights defenders, the lawyers, the journalists that we've been talking about, more and more we see national security crimes, allegations being used against people just for speaking up, for countering some small human rights violations going on the ground. And so it's no surprise that as the Olympics were drawing near, that these numbers would go up, because obviously one of the things that we see Beijing is very afraid of, the CCP is very afraid of, is being exposed. It's just the thing that they hate the most of all, right? They react almost allergically to it. So making sure not only that the journalists are neatly kept in their bubble and cannot actually speak to people, but making sure that anyone that might be able to cause a fuss, anyone that might be able to shed a light on what is actually going on, is not in circulation, is carefully kept away. It's the usual tactics that we've seen every single time. And again, it just goes to highlight, we went through this before the 2008 Olympic Games. So we knew what had happened. We have seen since then that things have only gotten worse. Before the 28 Games, there was at least some attempt to get some concessions from the regime in Beijing, to get some small improvements. One of the things was the Freedom of Information Act, which has actually been quite useful in those years following the 28 Games. But in recent years, it's just been hollowed out as well, obviously. But this time, we didn't even see an attempt to get any concessions from the Chinese regime, to make any improvements, to make sure that what happened before those games in 28 did not happen again. It's just like we've lain flat on our bellies and just let them do whatever they wanted. But there's actually people paying the price for that.
And so, speaking of the IOC, it seems like Beijing in these types of situations will kind of use the IOC, or in the past, say the UN, or it was the pandemic, the WHO, these establishments as a kind of shield to be like, well, look, we're just following the rules, say, in the IOC and any of these institutions. But how many of those rules that they are following are actually implemented, like, say, by Beijing themselves? Like, how is this all playing out?
Well, it's as with everything with Beijing. It's unrestricted warfare. So and a component of that are the three warfares, and a component of that is lawfare. So they'll use the regulations and the laws that are convenient to constrain others, but they don't think that it is something that can be used to constrain them. That's quite overt. And that combines with this desire for China to be recognized as number one. I mean, the goal of the Chinese state in the Olympics isn't just to do well, and it isn't just to beat everybody else. It's actually to win every single medal in every single category, right? I mean, that's the goal. And to do that, if you're applying an unrestricted warfare type of approach to it, nothing is off the table. So if you're going to use kind of micro impediments for competitors, for example, they don't get a good night's sleep, or they don't get good food, or they get repeatedly, aggressively COVID tested, including in very invasive ways that has a psychological effect. These are all absolutely to be expected. And if you don't think the Chinese Communist Party will do this in the Olympics in order to win, in order to come out as number one, look at what happened with COVID. I mean, they had an epidemic that they knew had human-to-human transmission, which was why they blocked internal flights in China, but they still allowed external flights. So they were willing to say, okay, we're going to take a hit, we're going to be damaged, but we can still win comparatively if everybody else is also damaged, and damaged more. So we will try to spread this around. So that's kind of the psychology of the Chinese Communist Party in terms of comprehensive national power. And if they're applying this to the Olympics, imagine what they're willing to do in order to get as many medals as they possibly can to the people who we've sent there in all good faith to represent their own countries.
First of all, when it comes to the bigger topic, for example, the UN, I mean, they very conveniently leave out those instances where UN independent experts, UN special procedures, also look at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Obviously, we're all very eagerly awaiting that report on Xinjiang to come out. We hoped it would have happened before the Olympics. But so, those instances where people are actually speaking up against what's happening in China, those human rights violations. They're not talking about those, and those are actually the independent UN experts, which I would say carry a lot more value in this instance. Obviously, they like to refer to those instances, for example, UN Human Rights Council, where they'll have some friendly regimes, basically repeating the lines that Beijing wrote for them. So obviously there is an issue in what reporting, but we know how this censorship and propaganda works. We saw it with the WHO. We all became aware, I think, of the huge issues we have when countries such as China have too big a role in those institutions, when they have the opportunity to actually control the narrative, to set the narrative. The same is happening with the IOC. I think the IOC has been facing rightfully a lot of backlash also over their handling or non-handling of the Peng Shuai crisis. She is still missing to all effects. The IOC has not been willing to address that. They have been aiding and abetting the CCP and kind of covering that up. They're continuing this because they announced that they will be meeting her for a dinner or something in Beijing during these Olympics. So yes, obviously it is a big issue. I think increasingly though, people are seeing through the propaganda. They're starting to see through the censorship. And so I hope also the people in these institutions become aware that they will be held accountable, that people are watching, and that people are not naive. We know what is going on.
So it sounds like Beijing has kind of created itself as a regime of fear, no matter where anyone is in the world. So in light of that kind of environment, what would be some, say, actionable steps people can implement? Because it seems, unfeasible that people would just live under fear, say, even in a free country. So what could be done?
Thanks for highlighting the fact that this is spreading around the world. Obviously, we're talking about the athletes now there, but increasingly also the people outside China, the huge exiled communities, but not even only them. I mean, we've had members of parliament in Denmark and the UK warned not to travel to countries with extradition treaties because they might be at risk of persecution. We're seeing institutions like Interpol, International Policing Cooperation Organizations, engaging with China, letting their abuse of the system continue. So there is actually a lot that we can do at home, and that's where we need to start. So start protecting the communities here, the exiled communities here, making sure that human rights defenders, activists here feel free to speak up, that they feel free to enjoy the rights, that are enshrined in the constitutions in the US, in Europe, in the UK, that they feel free to move, that they feel free to speak up. That's where we need to start. And there's some very small points that we can do to achieve that. One is suspend or recede from all extradition treaties. The CCP has been seeking extradition treaties agreements, judicial cooperation agreements across the board in the world in the past years. There's a reason they want that. One is that they want to make sure that people abroad do not feel safe. We had the demonstration just last week during the regular foreign ministry press conference in Beijing, the day after our involuntary returns report came out. When they were asked about this report, the spokesperson reiterated he wanted to make sure that people around the world, so-called fugitives, which include political dissidents, which include ethnic and religious minorities, he wanted to make sure they knew, because he stated expressly, we will chase you till the end of the earth. So this is the feeling, the fear they want to instill. And the way we need to counter this is by making sure that they cannot actually get to these people where we are. There's a second reason to doing this, to putting an end to these extradition treaties, reviewing these judicial cooperation mechanisms, because it's very clear that the CCP has been seeking to legitimize its judicial system, which is completely fraudulent, which is corrupt, which does not respond to any international standard whatsoever. But they seek to legitimize it. And this goes back to what you said in the beginning, when you said, they refer to the UN or the IOC or the WHO. They also refer to, but look at this, the Australian Federal Police signed a cooperation agreement with us. Oh, look at this, the UNODC, signed a cooperation agreement with us. Oh, look at all these countries signing an extradition treaty with us. This shows that we're not doing that bad. So taking away that legitimacy I think is a very powerful tool in actually telling them, look, if you want to cooperate, if you want to dialogue, there's certain rules that you need to abide by. And it's the rules that you've inscribed in your own constitution, and it's the rules that you've subscribed to at the UN. So we're just asking you to respect those. Otherwise, we cannot continue this kind of cooperation. I think those are some very small mechanisms that actually might create some leverage, some dialogue with a regime which, in the face of non-response, non-action, is just getting more and more brazen. And now, as we see, increasingly expanding that rule of fear at home to the entire world.
So it depends on whether you have any linkages into China. So if you have family or businesses in China, you're a hostage no matter where you are in the world. So that's it's a very difficult situation, and we see it through things like Operation Fox Hunt, which where dissidents around the world, especially in the U.S., are being targeted and potentially kidnapped and brought back. This was brought up with FBI Director Wray was talking about also quite recently about how aggressive the China has become internationally. So if you have a linkage into China, it becomes very difficult. So I would recommend don't do business with the Chinese Communist Party. Don't invest. Make sure your funds aren't there. You might think, oh, I'm not ethnic Chinese. I don't have linkages. I don't have ties into China. But if you have any money invested, you might want to take a look, because whoever's investing your money might have those complications involved, and they might be making decisions based on their fear of the party or bribery from the party, as opposed to your best interests. As individuals who don't have a linkage into China, you have the privilege of being able to talk about these things in a way, that is honest and direct, and that gives cover for the people who are being persecuted and who are suffering quite severely. And again, primarily it's the Chinese people. So there is a responsibility there. It can definitely come with a cost, but we are at this point, as I said, we don't know which way it's going to go. So if you don't like this particular direction, if you don't want your countries to become more like China, then it's not going to get easier to fight it. It's going to get harder. So you do it when you can, and you do it as much as you can. You raise your own understanding and the understanding of those around you. And again, you try to make sure that your mind space is yours, is your own, and help others as well.
And is there anything else you'd like to add?
Well, obviously, we always like to call on governments, those that have adopted Magnitsky legislation, that the legislation that allows to impose individual sanctions on the worst perpetrators of human rights crimes and atrocities, to use that more, to dare to use that, to coordinate with other partners, to make sure that those people are held to account. And I would say, on holding to account, also start a dialogue here at home again with those organizations, with those companies that are maybe based here, and have them take a look at their human rights record. How are they behaving? And is this something they want to continue engaging with?
Again, I think that the front line really is in our own minds. And the more we talk about it and the more we think about it, the more likely we are to not do what we're doing now, which is put in harm's way people who've worked really, really hard to get where they are and who just want to represent their country and move forward in fellowship, which is exactly not what the Chinese Communist Party wants from these Olympics.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Great to have you on the show.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Thank you very much.
And for those just tuning in, that was today's special episode with Laura Harth, Campaign Director with Safeguard Defenders, and Cleo Paskal, Associate Fellow at Chatham House. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.